unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grand Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan. A Sixth of Humanity, Independent India's Development Odyssey is a landmark new book by the scholars Devesh, Kapur and Arvind Subramanian. The book is an audacious attempt to trace how India, uniquely and daringly, attempted 4 concurrent transformations: building a state, creating an economy, changing society, and forging a sense of nationhood under conditions of universal suffrage. The book is the joint product of one of India's most respected political scientists and one of its best-known economists. It includes insights from politics, from history, literature. It provides a developmental history of India that is big, it is bold, engaging, and utterly unique. To talk more about their book and the lessons it holds for India's next 75 years, I'm pleased to welcome Devesh and Arvind back to the podcast. Devesh is the Starr Foundation Professor of South Asia Studies at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. Arvind is Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. He previously served as the Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India. Devesh and Arvind, huge congratulations, and it's a real pleasure that we can help launch this book with you.
Thanks so much, Milan. Much of this book would not have happened without your help along the way.
Exactly. So it's a double benefit for us to talk to you and to thank you as well.
Well, it's been a pleasure to have been sort of present at the creation, to see how this book got started and to see where it's ended up. I had the chance to read previous versions, but I finally read the final version, and I'm excited for everyone else to read it. And I want to take us back, if I could, to that early moment when the two of you were brainstorming this idea. And Devesh, I want to ask you the very question that you start the book with, right? Which is, why write a book looking back over the entire 75 years of India's development odyssey? And why do that now?
Well, I can turn it around and say, well, you ask why, I ask why not. Well, I think Arvind and I, for the past decade, have been sort of debating. We found that much of the work on India in political science and economics was extremely narrow. And some of the books either had a prior sort of argument, and we felt strongly that, that if we could build strong data across a variety of indicators and allow the argument to come from the data rather than a priori impose our hypotheses. And second, as you said, is that because we both also work broadly on economic development, that young nations do not have the luxury to undertake economic development in isolation. They have to build a state, they have to develop a sense of nationhood, and in India's case in particular, given the extremely hierarchical nature of Indian society and its many, many social cleavages, is to transform society. So one cannot look at economic development in isolation from these other transformations, which of course have to occur concurrently. So that's why we thought that we should try to have a book that's comprehensive, looking at the past 75 years. And in many ways, Ram Guha's book, as you know, on India after Gandhi, was like a guiding light in the sense of its sweep, the ease of how easy it is to read, and in that sense, it was an inspirational book, like for us.
I've often taken to describing the book as the political economy version of Ram Guha's book, India After Gandhi. Arvind, I don't know if you like that description or not, but what I mean by that is, I think why Ram's book has stood the test of time is, for multiple reasons, but one is that it's very accessible. You really don't need to have any prior understanding, introduction to India to pick it up. It's comprehensive in the sense that it It doesn't touch on every single issue under the sun. No book could do that, but it gives you a sense of the sweep of events from 47 to the present. The book came out, of course, now, almost 20 years ago. And of course, it represents, in a sense, a kind of culmination of a kind of career's worth of work. I mean, Arvind, just to ask you to reflect on this for a moment, I know that you guys had this debate, and the debate, in a sense, is reproduced for readers themselves in the book about, should this book be a retrospective gaze on what's come before? Should it be argument, right? And there are pluses and minuses to doing both. Your approach, in your own words, as you describe it, is argument anchored in history and data. And you go on to say our arguments are based on facts. Our facts are not based on arguments. I wonder just if you could say a bit more about your vision for the kind of book you wanted to produce.
Firstly, just to one additional thought to what Devesh said, right? I think that these days, the compulsions of academics forces you to be narrow and within silos than cut across silos. And we have different backgrounds, different kinds of expertise. And I thought there's a kind of synergy in bringing it together, which makes it more comprehensive than just any book on economic development. And also, just analytically, just to think about this, take last year's Nobel Prize winners, right? They won the Nobel Prize for saying institutions are very important. So the debate in one section of economics is state versus markets, state capacity, institutions, and so on. But we know that that's, as Devesh said, is a fairly limiting way to look at development. So in some ways, we want this book not just to be about India, but also a book that helps us think slightly differently about development, more largely. So, state versus markets, old debate, yes, very important, but very limiting. From Polanyi, we know that, states and markets are embedded in society. And so that's why the society element comes in. In India, with the complication that, the early leaders wanted to actually transform society. And then, of course, a topic that economists shy away from, how do you build a nation? It's rooted in identity. It's rooted in this, this kind of crooked timber of humanity that India was, with all its cleavages that Devesh spoke about. And, it's important because if you don't have that, you don't have order, you don't have, you have economic chaos, disorder, which affects long-run development. So this kind of apparatus, as it were, or framework is broader, is something that we wanted to bring. Then second, the question that you asked directly, to be a bit personal here, I think, when I was in government and wrote these economic surveys, it did seem that you could use a lot of data and at least try and make it comprehensible. So a different way of putting Ram Guha's achievement was it was comprehensive and comprehensible both to readers. And kind of that's what Devesh and I wanted to do. But then, as you said, data, argument, data. I actually think the challenge is actually even more than that, right? If you write a book as big and long and comprehensive as this, you can fall into one of two traps. History, this happened and that happened, and, this period was interesting, that period. And then it becomes kind of diffuse with no kind of common thread, as it were, right? But then on the other hand, if you say, I want one thread running through the piece, then you miss the rich texture of, and by definition, India, is so rich that you can't capture everything. So it's kind of trying to straddle those two things is what, we try to do in the book. And hopefully, it's comprehensible and comprehensive, and both makes an argument, but not. Also, see, there are these standard cliches about India. Everything and its opposite is true. That's probably true of every country in the world, right? I mean, so that's not very interesting. So the question is,
I know people who hate that Joan Robinson quote with a passion because it's used to death and could be deployed for China or anything else, right?
Exactly. So just getting a fact, argument, but also theme or multiple themes. And I think, Milan, one way in which we've tried to do that, of course, we'll come to that. I mean, hopefully there are one or two common themes running through the book, but that every chapter, what we try and do is to motivate each chapter via an argument or a hypothesis or an assertion or fact that then makes not only tries to make unity through the whole book, but also in each chapter.
So, Arvind, let me just push you on one thing, right? You mentioned when you were CEA to the government of India, the economic surveys that you put out, and I know that you put a great effort into trying to connect with the larger audience, right? And succeeded in large part in doing that. But there was one particular graph that you've used there, you've used elsewhere, which builds on the Acemoglu-Robinson story of the relationship between democracy and development, right? Where you have a simple graph with democracy on the x-axis, development on the y-axis, and a nice kind of 45-degree line, which kind of tells the story. Theirs is a causal story saying, the more inclusive your political institutions are, the more prosperity you'll have. But on that chart, there are two massive outliers, right? One is China, which is way richer than it should be for its level of democracy, and one is India, which is way poorer than it should be. And in some sense, it seems to me that part of your intervention in this book is understanding why India is located in that particular quadrant.
Absolutely. That's very well put. In fact, Devesh and I in the book, we've actually used that chart. It's the first and the last chart, or a variant of that chart is both the first chart of the book and the last chart of the book as well. Because I think, look, one of the most distinguishing things about India is that you spoke about the four transformations, Milan, right? But unlike almost any country in the world, there are few small countries, all this was sought to be achieved through universal suffrage from day one, through democratic politics, right? And that's what distinguishes India. So one of the big themes of the book is what were the costs and benefits of that as well. The precocious democracy line that Devesh and I have been thinking about for 10 years. And certainly, there is a kind of refinement of that original point that we say at the end of the book, which is that not only are these two outliers, it turns out that India is even amongst democracies, it's kind of an outlier. And that's what makes it a kind of precocious democracy, as it were.
So, Devesh, I want to just now kind of get into the heart of the book, right? And that entire first part of the book is really concerned with what you call the Hobbesian state, right? Which is how India established order. And, I think that makes a lot of sense, given that order is, at the end of the day, the very foundation of any polity, right? Irrespective of regime type, right? I mean, there's a famous line from Samuel Huntington, right? From his book in the 1960s about, the biggest difference between countries is the degree of order, not their whether democracy or autocracy. I just want to quote a passage that you have in that section and ask you to reflect on it. You say, India stands out not in how much violence it has witnessed, but the contrary. It did better than the West and other decolonizing nations, despite its abject poverty. This achievement, however, failed to translate into effective rule of law. And I want you to just reflect a bit on that paradox. So, compared to other countries, I mean, certainly, Europe over the sweep of centuries, very little violence, but yet an extremely checkered record upholding the rule of law. Why? How are those two things coexisting?
I mean, in one way, I think we argued, in a sense, democracy giveth and the democracy taketh away. I think one of the fundamental achievements of India's democracy is that it was a key tool of state and nation building. And you know that much violence occurs in the process of nation building. Most nation building is accompanied by high levels of violence. And democracy, right from the beginning, helped in basically managing it because, part of democracy, and especially the early decades, it involves a whole series of compromises. However, the other aspect of democracy, which is elections, politicians seeking money and power, a sort of area which you've written so well on. That, I think, has meant that having a weak rule of law is not happenstance, but it's by design. There is no doubt, and we show that repeatedly, acute awareness of need to invest more, find institutional answers to improve. We always talk of the backlog of cases in India's courts running into tens of millions. Well, you can read about it in official reports in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2010s, 2020. Every decade there's a big report, parliamentary discussion, all of that. Nothing happens. Same with about the police, that it needs autonomy, politicians need to interfere every decade, and we show it. So acute awareness of the issue, nothing is done, and it's not done because those in power have strong strategic interests not to do so.
Yeah. So I think just on this, it's a little bit also a temperamental difference that Devesh is the kind of more sober, bordering on pessimism, and I want to see the plus side, because I don't think we should lose sight of the fact here, and Devesh, in this and all your other work as well, that lots of micro disorder and even meso disorder, as it were, right? Which manifests in lack of rule of law, which has affected investment, which has affected small and medium business enterprises, violence against women on a quotidian basis, etc., etc. But all this should not obscure this massive achievement of how a poor country, had a modicum of not just social and political, but also economic order. And something closer to me, if you look around the world in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, hyperinflation, financial crises, economic instability, India was relatively better off. And since, 1991, India has never been to the IMF even once. Inflation has been much lower than other developing countries. And so, these are all big achievements. But of course, exactly, Devesh is exactly right on this other stuff, which has not been unimportant, by the way. So in some ways, the way I would phrase one way, and I'm not the political scientist, that, the Hobbesian state needs to provide order and rule of law. The first was very well done. The second, less so.
In fact,
just from an economist's perspective, right, Arvind, just to kind of draw you out a little bit more, that dichotomy that you pointed out kind of explains India's economic situation today, right, which is that it is growing at 6 or 6.5%. But one reason you've argued it hasn't been growing at 8.5 or 9% is precisely because things like rule of law, contract enforcement, certainty, the tax inspectorate, so on and so forth, there have not been concurrent moves to curb those excesses.
Exactly. And, we call this in terms of, we could call this in terms of, the risks of doing business. The lack of rule of law just enhances, if you weaponize the state to, whatever, arbitrary tax enforcement, which affects small and medium business enterprises, for example, also, the playing field is not level, tilted in favor of some, against the rest. Exactly all of these. And I think, the point that Devesh makes very often is that, the impact of all of this on small and medium enterprises, right? If you combine, this with all this criminality that happens, quotidian daily life of, people in terms of violence, in terms of, being able to carry on the small activities that they need to do, those get affected quite a bit. So it's not just at the macro investment level, but also at a micro, small, medium enterprise, all these get affected by this lack of rule of law.
Just to, if you have a small enterprise, what really matters is, are you getting shaken down every second day? Yes, inflation might be low and, foreign exchange reserves are rising. But if you are, in many parts of the country that we know, that you will get shaken down. At some point, you're just not willing to invest because you know that your profits will be siphoned away by being shaken down by X and Y.
So let me kind of segue now to talking about some of the chapters on the kind of economic history of India. And, I think one of the main objectives of the book really is to provide a overarching framework for how we can understand India's overall development arc in the post-47 era, right? And I think what's so nice about these chapters is you really try and puncture some myths which have been bandied about the Indian economy. And right. And one of those myths I want to ask you about is about the early planning phase that we've heard so much about, and it kind of looms so large in the kind of lore of Indian economic history. I want to quote again something that you write in the book. You say, India throttled its domestic private sector instead of cosseting it via protectionism. The only genuine period of import substitution was the decade of the 1980s. And then when India finally did get around to ISI, or import substitution, it twisted it to the point that it self-sabotaged the entire strategy, right? And I thought this in some ways was one of the most interesting insights of the book. And Arvind, maybe I'll just start with you. Tell us a little bit about what you think we've all gotten wrong about how we've interpreted and talked about the state-directed development during the planning era.
Yeah. Firstly, Milan, I want to say that we've misdiagnosed and misappreciated, a lot of Indian history. But let's turn to the planning era in particular. I would say that there are, I think, two maybe misconceptions. One bigger, one maybe lesser. One is on the outcome and the performance. There is a kind of revisionist view, or not even, maybe even slightly mainstream view, which says, look, we didn't do that badly in the first 3 years, in the first 30 years, first 3 decades. We grew at about 3.5%. And if you look around, if you certainly, and this is the argument that many people make, if you compare it with the preceding 30, 40 years under colonialism, this was a significant improvement. And especially if you take account of the circumstances and so on. So the one thing first thing we say in that book is that's kind of too charitable an interpretation, right? First, if you compare India in the cross-section of countries, in 1950, if you look at per capita GDP, we were the 21st poorest country. And 1980, we were the 15th poorest country. I think it's deteriorated between that. And much more important, many of the other attributes of structural transformation, for example, poverty reduction, educational attainment, exports, a series of indicators, they deteriorated in the first 30 years. Now, the one comparison we make is with China, just to illustrate our point in that. And it's very interesting, Milan, that we think of China as having taken off and pulled away from India from 1980 onwards. But actually, if you look at the data of 50 and 80, actually a big part of the divergence has already happened by 1980. And the salient point here is that in the 50s, 60s, 70s, China was a god-awful mess. You had the Great Leap Forward, you had the rectification campaign. So, and we have this data on the black market premium comparing India and China. There's no comparison. China is just off the charts. So the point is that despite China being so unstable, if you look at, even per capita GDP, but certainly productivity in agriculture, social, educational attainment, by 1980, China has pulled ahead, even though by 50 and 1960, it's either there or thereabouts or slightly behind. So the performance per se is, I think, misunderstood and maybe a bit too charitable. The other is the point that you make, and which is something that I do think is an important point that Devesh and I often discuss, is that we think of the first 30 years as import substitution because we erected all these barriers to reduce foreign competition in all varieties of ways. Now, I think that's just a complete analytical category mistake, because the point of protection is you want to favor the domestic enterprise. In India, what ended up happening was we actually throttled domestic private enterprise through all kinds of means, but especially industrial licensing. So in a sense, the objective of protecting domestic industries was you turned around and completely, kind of neutered or even, eviscerated that by imposing a massive tax on the domestic private sector. So that's why I think that period is better characterized as a scarcity economy, not an import substitution. Because if you look at the four major actors, in terms of enterprise, foreign competition, basically out. Small-scale industries favored in that era, but they were all inefficient, no incentives to become efficient. Public sector favored, again, no accountability, no incentives. And then the private sector was crushed. So your supply side was completely throttled and you have scarcity. And I think Mukul Keshavan has a lovely phrase where he describes that, something like, where it's felt as an absence of material things, which is like a superior form of austerity. And so that's why I think both on performance and on understanding what we did policy-wise, we misinterpreted the first 30 years.
I mean, Devesh, when it comes to the economy, you both note that there were three crucial choices that India made: planning, creating a dominant public sector, neglecting trade. Those, if you want to be charitable, can't be described as mistakes necessarily because, they were part and parcel of the zeitgeist of the time, right? It was kind of in the air. It was in the water. But you do specifically attribute blame to policymakers in India for two other decisions. One is neglecting agriculture, right? And the second is what Arvind just referred to, crushing the domestic private sector. And I wonder if you could just say a little bit about these unforced errors and their long-term consequences. I know on ag in particular, it's been a particular passion and interest of yours in other work that you've done.
No, see, India was overwhelmingly a rural society. And most Indians, agriculture was the key sort of part of the economy. No large country has ever developed without first having a robust agricultural sector. Now, in India's case, there were two challenges in agriculture. One, of course, was about the sort of feudal inheritance. So land reforms were a major challenge. Now, here's where you see the other side of democracy. Land reform has only occurred in the world under authoritarian regimes. Democracies have always found it very hard. And with the Congress in power, the state level Congress leadership was very much part of the upper caste that owned much of the land and were obviously trying to sabotage land reform. A second part came from India's federal structure. Essentially, agriculture is a state subject. Now, of course, in those years, in the early decades, the center had a much greater role. But nonetheless, especially if you look at over time, what is interesting is that even when India changed its agricultural policies with the Green Revolution, etc., and especially in the last 30-odd years, the instruments of improving agriculture have essentially been around subsidies. Rather than what was there early on in the Green Revolution, which is to raise yields. And even now, in a number of major crops, India's yields lag China in some cases by half. And that's been very puzzling because, especially when from the 70s onwards, when the regional parties came to power, they had their social base was much more in rural India, much more in agriculture. But again, you see almost no interest at all in the key area of trying to raise yields. In fact, what we see is in the last quarter century, that Indian agriculture has been doing reasonably well, but it's driven by horticulture, animal husbandry, milk, eggs, meat, fruits, vegetables. the areas where the state is hardly involved, whereas the area where the state piles with subsidies and price control and procurement, which is basically cereals, you see that the growth is really, really poor. And it's this puzzle that it's not because, earlier on, if you remember, Michael Lipton has this piece on urban bias and so on in the 70s. But, especially in the States, I mean, the representatives are largely coming from rural parts of the state. And agriculture is a state subject. They could have done much more in this area, but it came down to a complete lack of imagination and very, very limited number of instruments.
Just to add to what Devesh said, and I don't know what Devesh you think about this also, and something that actually we point out in the book is, in some ways, Milan, you rightly said that many of the choices reflected the zeitgeist of the time, right? And this whole heavy industrialization-led growth was a big part of that, right? I think when you do that, if you're going to emphasize one sector, you're going to neglect another sector. It's kind of, especially in terms of the resources. So I think there was a kind of ideological component to this as well, that we looked to, Russia, China, the West, as the models to follow, right? And there's also the Lewis model. We were all enthralled to this, as Malanobis was besotted with Russia, and the Russian model. It's in fact called the Feldman-Malanobis model. So I think ideologically we looked to the West, Russia, China. And as Devesh always points out, we never looked east in terms of what Japan or Korea or Taiwan were doing, right? Where in fact they'd really emphasized land reform, agricultural productivity, and so on. So I think there was also that ideological component and the kind of where our gaze always went for the elites, as it were. And I think that also, led to explains, the neglect or not putting enough emphasis on agriculture, that you would think that politics, number of people employed in agriculture would otherwise force you to do.
But isn't there a tension here? Because, you refer at one point in the book to this, the famous kind of Nehruvian notion of, dams as India's modern temples. But one of the things you then go on to say is the problem wasn't that India was using too much concrete to build stuff. It didn't use enough concrete to build stuff. So even though you put a lot of your eggs in that basket, even on those terms itself, India underperformed.
One of the things was that in those years, and that's the unfortunate large collateral damage of a scarcity economy. Most projects, these capital, were delayed by years, which added further leg to their costs and effectiveness. And partly they were delayed because to build a dam, you need cement, you need steel. But you are constraining cement supply and steel because you're not allowing private sector, and the public sector is inefficient. Because you're putting in so much money in that, you're not investing enough in the railways. Well, therefore, there are transportation bottlenecks. So each of them sort of becomes adds on leg to the other. And delays then become endemic in project completion. And that means that the fruits of these investments are also much, much more delayed.
I think coming back to Milan, the point that you raised about our kind of taking issue with this, there was too much concrete and our contention's not enough concrete. I think that links in addition to what Devesh says about, the scarcity economy, which is very important. But I think part of that was, what were the choices in favor of the public sector. But I think there is a sense in which India underinvested in infrastructure and public goods in the early years. and only in the late 90s and then 2000s did it really come back. And that's the sense in which, the concrete thing, I think, is relevant. And so this is a broader indictment of Indian strategy that, one way to put it is that you emphasize state capitalism over state provision of, public goods. And that was one of the mistakes, which in turn led to the scarcity and all the complications that Devesh just spoke about. So I think that those policy choices kind of get emphasized, as it were.
So we have a quote from, because for one of the, I think, other hopefully contributions of this book is we've just gone through literally thousands of official reports and documents. And one of them, which is trying to do some administrative reforms, sort of looks at Kerala, the IAS officers, what they spend their time on. This is in the 60s. And of course, the IAS officers, they say that they spend so much of their time on allocating cement. Because you had a cement controller. In a scarcity economy, you're not using the price. It's an administrative mechanism. So someone has to administer. So it goes to the DM for the district, and that's what he's spending his time rather than what a district magistrate is supposed to do. So you have all these ripple effects.
Correct.
Which have far more consequential than the original problem you're trying to resolve.
Yeah, in fact, that's a really important point because, see, when we think about those early years, Milan, right, and the scarcity economy, which I think is the way to look at those first 30 years, the example that Devesh just gave, right, I think it feeds into this broader Bhagwati idea of the directly unproductive profit-seeking activity. One, he emphasized how, the private sector, basically spends resources on lobbying and getting around the scarcity, which is completely, negative social value. And Devesh's point is that the state actor spends, when you talk about state capacity, so both the private sector does directly unproductive profit-seeking activity, and the bureaucrat is also doing completely directly unproductive, not profit-seeking, whatever, managing allocation, managing scarcity activity. So you get this double whammy, which in some ways may have been even more consequential, as Devesh says, than whatever we did on, prices going up or whatever, right? Yeah.
Hey, Grand Tamasha listeners, thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grand Tamasha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out. Arvind, I want to link to a somewhat related point now on the economy, right? Which, because we're now talking a little bit at sort of vested interests and so on. When it comes to the realities of the fiscal state, right, which is raising revenue, spending resources, you both write that we can think of the Indian fiscal state as what you call the Kamadhenu state, right? Which is the kind of bovine goddess of Indian mythology, which, as you write, is suckling India's numerous clamoring constituencies. Unpack for us a little bit that metaphor of the Kamadhenu state and what you hope to convey with that kind of image.
Yeah. So I think one or two data points, Milan, to kind of motivate this topic, right? First, which came as a surprise to both of us, frankly, that if you look at fiscal deficits, overall fiscal deficits in a broad general government sense, and especially after 1990, this is a period of growth and liberalization and things. In that period, India has amongst the highest deficits amongst comparator countries, certainly very high, upwards of 10% of double digits on average between that period. So it's kind of a weak fiscal state, right? That's one. The second data point, which I think again struck us, and I've kind of still reel at that, which is that India's tax to GDP ratio in the era of rapid growth from 1990 onwards has been pretty much stagnant for 35 years at about 17% of GDP. Now, you would think that if growth is at 6-7% consistently, this would rise. So these two kind of facts say, why? Why is this happening, right? So what Devesh and I, one explanation we give is this, precocious democracy and the Kamadhenu democracy, which is essentially that, we think of India, even, Bardhan's famous book, for example, identifies 3 important special interests, right? And I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think maybe farmers and bureaucrats are exceptionally well, cosseted by the Indian fiscal state. But the Indian democracy is such that almost every interest group, can be a constituency clamoring for something from the state. And you see that in the data. If you look at the tax side, for example, the rich get subsidies, the poor get subsidies, the middle class get subsidies, farmers get subsidies, property owners don't get taxed or get exempted from the tax debt. And on the expenditure side, every kind of species of constituency that you can think of, if you had a Noah's Ark of constituencies, and they're all getting, the fertilizer subsidy, the railway subsidy, everyone.
Subsidy. The power subsidy.
The power subsidy, all of them, power, very important, fertilizer subsidy. So in a sense that, so many clamoring constituencies. And democracy, if you think of democracy as accommodation, and on top of that, the point that Devesh, often makes, that if you have this in a context of elections, which we'll come to, which are becoming more and more frequent, and we can talk about that later, you get this situation where, everyone gets a piece of the fiscal thing. No one is exempt from the subsidies. No one is included in the tax, or very few, and you get this kind of Kamadhenu. And in fact, I.G. Patel has one of those really thoughtful economists and policymakers, has this quote somewhere where he says that, the workings of a parliamentary democracy, legitimizes, creates an eclectic melange of, all kinds of special pleading, which, you have to cater to. And in a sense, this in turn legitimizes democracy and the precocious democracy.
I want to kind of circle back to something that we touched upon earlier, but I think it needs a little bit of unpacking, because in some ways, when I reread the book, it stuck out as a much bigger theme, right? Which is really the focus on India's states, right? I think one major takeaway of this book is that we are shooting the wrong target if we exclusively focus on the union government in Delhi as opposed to the 28 state governments of India. And this comes up time and time again in the book when you diagnose India's developmental shortcomings. We spoke about agriculture earlier. On the question of state capacity, I just want to read a short passage from the book. You write, if the central government made at least occasional attempts at seriously studying administrative reforms and very occasionally launching new initiatives, state governments did not even go through the pretense of trying. Devesh, let me turn to you first. Why was it so important for you to focus on state level performance in a book that's about the entire sweep of India for 75 years?
I think particularly after Congress's sort of hegemony began to decline after the 67 elections, when non-Congress governments came to power, this constitutionally the states had much more to do with the one area that India has been especially weak at, which is public goods. Primary education, public health, public libraries, pavements in roads, drinking water, sewage, pollution, all of these courts, right? Police. Yeah. So law and order, all of these essential areas which everyone agrees that this has definitely not been India's strength.
Going back to the earlier comparison, right? That is one place where the East Asian economies really did invest. We know, for instance, in basic public goods like health, education, sanitation, and so on.
Right. And so we have a graph where we compare the percentage of public employees at the central, state, and local levels compared with the other giants, the United States and China. And India is a complete outlier. In the United States and China, most public employees are at the central, but especially at the local level. In India, it's the opposite. They're completely concentrated at the state level. And, we know that the sort of neglect that happened in the first 30, 40 years with agriculture in the last quarter century has been happening with urban areas. We know that given where India is now, a middle-income country, that urbanization has to be the engine of growth. But all of us know what Indian cities are like, and it's because they are completely under the control of state governments, which simply do not, in fact, they have completely sabotaged the 74th Amendment, which was expressly designed to give cities greater autonomy.
I mean, as you point out in the book, on a couple of occasions, the states have constantly asked for more decentralization and devolution to state capitals, but they have refused to give more decentralization to lower levels, right?
I think we have a quote from Raja Chelaya.
Yeah, everyone wants decentralization
from above, but doesn't want to give it below, right? And that's, I think... And we are not the first ones. Karthik Mullidharan has this huge book out, which is expressly focuses on states, like for these very reasons. So I think that's why we really wanted to say that, look, this was probably, the focus on the center was probably much more merited in the early decades when there was truly a much greater centralization. But surely in the past few decades, and we see, right, because we have a whole chapter where we look at economic performance across states, and we see there's much greater divergence. In fact, that's a source of worry on how much the states in the south and west are pulling away from those in the north and east. And that shows how much, if states get their act together, what they can do. And Arvind had written about this earlier, and we brought it into the book. The states in the south in the past 30 years have grown at rates very comparable to China.
And for as long. Yeah. So that's why I think, Milan, just to kind of step back and say, when we talk about the focus on the states, right, there's the one aspect about what Devesh just spoke about, states not providing public goods. A different way we say this in the book, whatever the center does badly, the states do worse in terms of providing these public goods. But then there's also the whole question, which, you and Devesh have thought about much more, as to why, accountability mechanisms are much weaker at the state level. So I think there's a whole discussion there, which I think much more we could discuss. So that's on the states and not providing public goods. But the other side is kind of the more, maybe again, the upbeat story, which Devesh just referred to, is, state level performance. 1/3 of India, population-wise, the South, the West, and, Haryana, have grown at Chinese rates of growth and for as long. For 35 to 40 years.
Yeah, so it's really a remarkable fact.
Yeah, it's remarkable fact. And what it shows is that, I think this actually raises a much bigger question, which we don't, I think address in the book, but it's a broader question for development, right? How do you understand development and even growth in a federal structure where, both, policy-making levers are shared, they're separate and overlap? And then the politics of center-state cooperation and also between states, So how should we think about development in federal structures? The Indian experience is very interesting and illuminating, but, I think we've only kind of scratched the surface of that. But you get both dimensions, the bad side, which is the state capacity, and the accountability side. But you also get, the fact of, competitive federalism and, when you take away the centralizing straitjackets, as it were, you get more, and you get more variety and diversity of performance.
No, just to add, I mean, we know, right? We always see references to the Kerala story when it comes to human capital. Now, if you read about that, and that foundation was laid even before it became a state under Travancore. Well, but there isn't any magic there. Everyone knew what Kerala did. There was no reason other states could not. This was not because the center didn't allow them to, do more on primary health and schooling, right? And so while we all discuss Kerala, it raises the puzzle. Well, what stopped any of the other states from doing it?
So can I just link these two ideas? What the kind of accountability in the states and performance, right? So when we talk about differential performance, the divergence, we have three categories of failures. We know about Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. That's a kind of category we know about. The lesser known categories are, Punjab, which actually is a star for 30 years. And like a star, it collapses after 1987.
So it's more like a meteor.
Like a meteor, exactly. Flames and flames out, right? But then I think the kind of the failure that's not given enough attention is what we call the long run reversal of fortune, which is West Bengal. Right. And there, it links to this thing about, this is, to me, it's a very, Devesh has lived in West Calcutta for a long time, Kolkata, and I haven't. But 33 years of uninterrupted CPM rule, i.e. democratic politics is, re-electing these leaders who are presiding over the long run, reversal of fortune, one of the richest states to one of the, states that massively underperformed. So I think all these dimensions of state performance are really quite interesting. And I think in the book we try and touch upon different aspects of that.
Well, I mean, just to, what I was thinking about when I was reading this section is, Arvind, you had a piece in the Financial Times, which we'll link to, about the Tamil Nadu model, which is your home state, but you've also studied it quite closely, where, when we, going back to the Devesh's line about, well, we knew what the keys to Kerala's success were. There was nothing holding back other states from replicating them. Instead of thinking about how does India do manufacturing right, we don't have to look at South Korea or Taiwan, correct, or we could look at Tamil Nadu, which, granted may have not had success on that level, but in terms of attracting, blue collar, low skilled labor in textiles and footwear and leather and garments and so on and so forth, has made real inroads. And there's nothing stopping other states from kind of replicating that. But there's a larger question here, which Devesh kind of hinted at, but I just want to flesh it out a little bit more completely, which is about the divergence story, right? I mean, Arvind, you had to deal with this when you were in government, and now you're outside of government kind of analyzing it. And, you write in this section when you're talking about state performance that Indian fiscal federalism is increasingly perceived by some of the richer states, particularly some of the southern states, as a quote-unquote internal aid model, which involved the significant redistribution of resources from richer to poorer states. But then you go on to say something that puzzled me a bit, and I want you to kind of explain yourself. You say, we don't endorse this view ourselves, but we think this model sheds some light on the threats to fiscal federalism today. Tell us a little bit, and Arvind, I'll start with you. Why do you refrain from endorsing this view? Because the data you provide seems to validate this thesis, as we do have an internal aid market at work.
I'll tell you, I think why we don't want to, take too strong a view on this, about characterizing this, is, you see, look, for this following simple reason, that when you have a nation, right, you want to knit it together, and, there are different regions, places bring different things to the table. So, in response to the incontrovertible thing that we show in the paper, that in terms of fiscal resources, there's more transfer from richer to poorer states, right? But there are other dimensions which we don't go into, like, for example, the common market. So, for example, Bihar could turn around and say, Tamil Nadu, we provide you cheap labor, or even Kerala, we provide you cheap labor. Therefore, while you may be transferring fiscal resources, we're
giving
transferring
you human resources.
Human resources. And similarly, that, we're providing a market for you, for example, right?
But also, just to add, Arvind, in the early decades, the freight equalization policy penalized the eastern states, especially Bengal, Bihar, undivided Bihar, and Orissa, and benefited the western and southern states.
So, exactly, that's a very good point. So that's why you have to take this into totality, and because you can't quantify these other things in a way that you can quantify the fiscal, the fiscal assumes salience. So one, that's why we should be careful about, giving it normative and terms which become kind of, pejorative at some point. I think that's one. But I do think that the fiscal dimension does acquire salience in the debate. That's what's happened. But let me just layer one final complexity here. One of the surprising things we found in this was that the biggest, quote-unquote, donors, fiscal donors, as it were, are not, it's not the southern states.
Right.
They're actually the western states and Haryana, right? And yet the clamor in India today, at least, is from the southern states, especially Tamil Nadu. So it's clear that the fiscal is only one dimension of the disaffection that's happening. There are other dimensions. In the case of Tamil Nadu, there's a whole subnational identity which is stronger. There's a language issue. There's the political centralization issue.
There's a partisan politics issue too, right? Because
exactly,
Maharashtra, Gujarat, which are BJP or NDA states, so that adds another color to it.
Exactly. But the last point I would say on this, which is that, the other reason why I think we should not call it an aid model is that some amount of redistribution is inevitable in any fiscal polity, right? I think what is becoming more and more problematic in India is that the identity of donors and beneficiaries is kind of fixed. And second, the magnitudes are rising.
Right.
And
they're
that
getting
becomes
bigger rather than getting smaller.
So at some point they become politically unsustainable, not because we are saying that, it's because people, the southern states. So it's managing that. So it's not getting away from aid, quote unquote, completely, but making it more politically sustainable. And of course, having a broader look of the kind that Devesh mentioned also, take into account. So that's, I think, why I think we should be careful to not be overly normative, at least as outside academics, about this.
Just to add, Milan, one of the things is that if you take this on per capita terms, actually it's Jammu and Kashmir and the Northeast that get way higher transfers. Now, we know that these are the regions where India's nation building has had its greatest challenges. And so there are very good political reasons, right? I mean, you could argue that whether that is necessarily good for Jammu and Kashmir in the Northeast, because, if I'm getting money in any case without doing that much work, why bother? But that's a separate point. But I think politically, fiscal federalism always has a strong redistributive goal, but will always have a strong political goal as well, especially for younger countries, for complex federal countries, where it is an important instrument of nation building. But as Arvind just said, you want to be careful that that instrument is not used you don't ride that instrument too hard.
Yeah. In fact, the point that Devesh just made about the Jammu and Kashmir Northeast, that's why we distinguish between what we call Hobbesian aid, which is in a sense aid that's necessary for nation building, especially external, and kind of more conventional development aid where all these other issues come in as well. Yeah.
So Devesh, I'm glad that you brought us here, because the kind of final big theme of this book I wanted to explore with you guys in this conversation is the one on nation building, right? Which I think there's a tension in the book, right? Which is that early on, Indian elites, they did a pretty good job of nation building, but they fell behind on state building. And in more recent years, I think you can argue we're kind of seeing the opposite, right? We're doing a better job. I mean, we can agree, disagree, but better job on building the state, but maybe underperforming on nation building. And I just want to quote your conclusion on this, which is that you say, in the ultimate analysis, the working of a constitution depends less on the document itself than on those tasked with implementing it. Regardless of the causes and consequences, sadly, the arc of India's distinctive nation building seems to be bending backwards, which is, I think, a very kind of eloquent way of putting it. Devesh, I want to just, maybe start with you, reflecting on where we are now, 2025, right? And now with the benefit of having studied 7.5 decades, say a little bit more about why you think the arc of India's distinctive nation-building vision or project is moving in the wrong direction.
So, when I was walking here for the podcast, I saw a FedEx guy with a package, and it had this label, fragile, handle with care. And I think I thought it was reflecting on the question, nation building, you must always keep that in mind, especially in a society which is as diverse as India's and with as strong subnationalisms as India has. And, one of the key reasons that early parts of nation building succeeded was that the leadership at that time interpreted democracy in a much deeper way. Elections was just one way to think about the democracy. But a key part was just broad sensibility of accommodation, of differences. And, we know that Nehru was strongly opposed to linguistic states. Right then, they saw the protests growing, the threats to nation building, and they accommodated that, right? And the threat was. Similarly, on the language issue, which really rose into Tamil Nadu, it was becoming a bigger and bigger challenge. They found a way to accommodate it. Where the two big cleavages, where I think today those accommodations have been considerably weakened. One is on religion. Very clearly, look, it's always been a challenge since independence, how to integrate the minority community, Muslims in particular. And the second is sort of regionalism, right? Not to impose a single language and to weave the thread of federalism in ways that every state feels equally part of the Indian Union. And I think this increased centralization, increased intolerance, both of these are the reasons we felt this arc is bending backwards. And why that matters for a book in economic development is, first, for a very simple reason. I mean, Muslims are India has about 200 million Muslims. Just arithmetically, if that larger group is not part of your economic growth story, it's going to be a break. I mean, forget anything else.
Right.
And we know, and Arvind has, of course, written about this much more, so many of the economic development challenges that India faces require much stronger cooperative federalism. They're not issues just of the center or just of the state. They need both. And where you have this lack of trust and growing mistrust, without which, how is India going to really address those challenges and which are mounting?
So just two small thoughts to add. One is Devesh mentioned the regional cleavage and the religious cleavage, but then I think there's also the castes cleavage,
Right.
which I think is very important and things. See, Milan, the thought that, or more a question than a answer or anything. It kind of begs the question of why, right? Why have we come to this? Why were the early successes are now, turning sour, whereas some of the early failures like the state building or even economic development, we've kind of partially reversed and so on. And, the thought that crosses at least my mind is that, were some of this because of the choices and the way we did the accommodations early on? Did we kind of sow to some extent the seeds of this? Just to give you one example, right? I mean, this is, again, very tricky territory, the religious accommodations being asymmetric. People feel some people asymmetric, we have to remedy them, etc., right? And the thing about caste and identity is that, once you kind of, build something in, and unless you have serious exit clauses out of this, it only gets reinforced and expanded, etc., etc., and we know that now we went from, my favorite phrase is Diana X. Now we're minting identity in ever smaller denominations, I mean, I think these are kind of deep and very difficult questions to answer. But the net result is exactly what Devesh is saying, that, that going back to, if you look at the span of history, right? We say we made mistakes in the first 30 years, but we also had this tremendous achievement of democracy, order and nation building, right? I mean, which in some ways are unheralded preconditions for our subsequent success, which we should never forget, right? But now, having achieved some of those successes, we are kind of undermining the foundations, because coming back to, everything, order, rule of law are fundamentally important for long run, even economic development. And we don't want to. And one manifestation, Devesh rightly pointed out, is that cooperative federalism is India's way forward. There is no getting away from that. States have more resources, they're becoming more powerful, but the center continues to be a very important player. Almost everything, I work on the power sector, for example, quite a bit. If you have to solve the power sector problem, it has to be with the center and states coming together. Agriculture, the same thing. GST, the same thing. You talk, issue after issue, and if we don't have that sensibility of accommodation, compromise, give and take, I think these things are going to suffer.
I mean, there was a nice piece today in the Hindustan Times by Yamini Iyer, and we'll link to that in the show notes, about the GST and the GST Council, reflecting on the 8 or 9 years of experience, right? And I think what was interesting about the piece is that there's a lot of blame to go around. I mean, Arvind, you were intimately involved with this. There's a lot of blame to be pointed at the center, but a lot of blame also be pointed towards the states, which in the GST debate, we often let them off the hook. But the broader issue is that the solution to this problem, and it's in a way a metaphor for other problems, is only when you can bring the center and states together in a venue and form where there is some kind of mutual trust and collaboration, right? And I think that kind of social norm of trust has deteriorated as the relationship between the center and the state capitals have deteriorated, particularly the opposition-ruled states. And that becomes very hard to reconstruct, right?
So Milan, I mean, a perfect example of that is air pollution in Delhi.
Right.
Because the way the winds blow, they don't care about, is this a center or is this a state?
Is this an opposition state or a ruling party state?
Exactly. And you simply cannot solve it. It's a tough challenge. It's a critical challenge. And for decades, it's not been, they've not been able to address it because it requires really the sort of trust that brings all parties together and you slowly chip away at the problem to gradually reduce it, because there simply is no magic bullet to so many of these problems.
And in fact, that's why, Milan, we end the book, the forward-looking chapter, exactly by starting with this, the Delhi air pollution problem, which is kind of a metaphor for what you just said and what Devesh was saying. That
so just let me pause you there, because this is where I want to end our conversation, is where you end the book, okay? Which is, you start by laying out these 4 big global disruptive trends whose effects are going to shape India's next 75 years, some of which India actually has no control over, right? So there's geopolitics. We've seen what's happened on the U.S.-India front, technology, right, and the kind of AI revolution, climate change, which, is linked to the issues that we've just been talking about, and demography. Now, I want to end with those as the kind of backdrop, right? Ask you a little bit about what you hope policymakers are going to take away from this book, because one distinguishing feature of your book is that you're not providing a laundry list of here's 47 things that you need to do and you need to do them yesterday, right? Because, that's not the kind of book this is, right? But nevertheless, there are important lessons from this massive product you put together. There are lessons for government. There's lessons for industry, for civil society, for the average citizen. So, just kind of as a way of kind of bringing this to a close, what in your mind are some of the main messages that you would like to leave these groups with, right? I mean, in some ways, I think if I were to kind of boil down what's come out of this conversation, and you kind of say it explicitly in the book, is it's not so much that India has a to-do list, it has a not to-do list.
Or an even an undo list.
Yeah, an undo list. So Arvind, maybe I just start with you. I mean, what is it that you hope that readers will take away in terms of some of the kind of real touchstones that come out of this work?
I mean, we've touched upon this already, Milan. A couple of things that, on the upside, I think India today is a very different place from 1980. This whole thing about the revolution of rising expectations is absolutely correct. People's appetites have been whetted for prosperity. Jobs, consumption, etc., and to be fair, the Indian aspiration, if not the achievement, is now benchmarking against global standards and build the best, biggest, brightest, fastest. It could be statues, temples, idols. It could also be train stations, commodity exchanges, whatever. So the aspiration is there. And so you have you call this guy maybe the irresistible force, but then there's kind of on the other side the immovable object, or I mean that's quite not probably a very good metaphor, but the do no harm lesson for India is we had some amazing successes as a young, divided, cleavage nation. Which was this sustaining democracy, sustaining federalism, a modicum of trust, a provisional sense of nationhood, the absence of disorder. These are all absolutely maybe not so visible, but undefinable, but no less important as preconditions for anything that you have to do. And we should not squander or undermine them in any way. And to the extent that we need, that's where the undo stuff comes in. We have to undo that. And, India has no other, the notion that some centralized, autocratic system like China will solve our problem is kind of pie in the sky. That's one thing. The second thing I would say, it's kind of more related to the bigger challenges that you said, especially geopolitics. One lesson I think one can take away from what's happening now and the role of China and everything is a line due to Vijay Kelkar. He said, the best foreign policy is 10% economic growth sustainedly. So economic dynamism, and that's the China experience, right? China's calling the shots in the world, even vis-a-vis its relationship with the United States, because it has managed this massive, delivered on dynamism and jobs for this. So to be very crude and reductive, don't undo, or let's undo maybe some of the things we've done to our great early achievements, but let's build on the successes that we've had in terms of state building and dynamism, but do much, much more there so that we are strong and resilient for whatever future is going to be ahead of us.
Devesh?
Yeah, so, I think what Arvind said, I'll put it in a short. You need to have the Hippocratic oath, which doctors supposedly sort of do no harm, right? But I think, to me, there are two other things, one could add, of course, more. See, what is the one thing that India has always had an excess of? Which is its people. That's why the title of our book, A Sixth of Humanity.
Right.
And what is the one thing that India has miserably failed to build is human capital, right? First, neglect of primary education, then starting from the 60s, how state by state, the public universities began to get destroyed. And then now, frankly, political control is weakening many central universities. The fact that more than 1 million young Indians leave the country for higher education, there's no better indictment of how India has weakened its higher education system. We say India is, it failed in manufacturing, but it's doing so well in services. Higher education is a service.
Right.
It's a service sector that, India should have been attracting 1 million students, not sending 1 million students. And everything from now, new technologies to everything, without human capital, you simply will not be able to go far. And it is the one area, India has a much greater opportunity because, as we point out in the book, now India's fertility rate decline has come so much faster. Now the number of children in schools has peaked. It's going to go in a steady decline throughout this century. So now you can move from quantity to quality. But there is such a degree of, the one consensus across all political parties, they all want to control higher education. And there is no way, if you seek that type of political control, that it can be the sort of asset that it needs to be for India to go where it wants to go. And last, I'll end with this one thing, which we have this in one of the chapters of the book, is the other consensus in India across parties and societies, everyone believes in the state. It doesn't matter, right, left, everyone believes, India is inherently a statist society, right? We call it the My Baap state. Well, if you so believe in the state, why are you so wary in trying to strengthen it?
Right.
The thing that you and I have both written about, why do you have such high vacancies in key areas? Right? I mean, we talked about police reforms. Forensic labs have like a 40-50% vacancy rate. So you know what you can do to solve crimes. And these are not hiring tens of thousands of people. Many of them are just hiring hundreds of people in a country of 1.5 billion people. So it's about systems, processes, organization. As you know, to be fair, most academics also, their eyes sort of glaze over when you talk about administrative reforms. It's an utterly non-sexy topic for everyone. But this is the bread and butter, right? I mean, if you didn't care about the state, fine. But everyone does care about it, so why not take modest efforts to make it somewhat more effective?
Sorry.
Yeah.
So Milan, at the risk, so we have to puncture ourselves at this stage. Both Devesh, both of us have committed this, maybe tending towards committing this sin, which is that Robert Solow said, all discussions of whatever growth development begin with great rigor and end in a blaze of amateur sociology, and producing lists and litany of lists. So I hope we've not been guilty of that, and thank you for this.
My guests on the show this week are the scholars Devesh Kapur and Arvind Subramanian. They are jointly the authors of A Sixth of Humanity, Independent India's Development Odyssey. To call it a landmark book sounds like an understatement. I mean, there is a nugget virtually in every paragraph, if not every sentence of this book, that you will take away, whether you know a lot about India, whether you know very little about India, whether you're an economist, political scientist, historian, or not at all in this field. Thank you both for this amazing piece of work, which, we could have talked much more about all the years that have gone into this, but thank you especially for taking the time for us today.
Thank you so much, Milan.
Yeah, and Milan, thanks once again. What I want to echo what Devesh said. This book wouldn't have been possible without your constant, input and guidance. So thanks a lot.
Thank you. Grand Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show, to support the work we do on Grand Tamasha, and to find the writing we mentioned on this week's episode, visit our website, grandtamasha.com. Tim Martin is our audio engineer. Mira Verghese is our executive producer. Additional assistance is provided by Annabelle Richter. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.